Hello, marine biologists. This is the second lecture in the series on the basics of biology. In the last lecture, we covered the fundamental components in the topic of biology: the cell, metabolism, responses to the environment, and reproduction. In today's lecture, we will cover the topic of evolution, which connects all branches of biological studies in a fundamentally essential way, which is why we are dedicating a separate lecture to the subject. So without further ado, let me turn off my camera and let's begin. In this lecture, we're going to focus on three main areas. The first deals with the history that led to our current understanding of evolution, so we'll take a look at Darwin and his history and some of the people that influenced him the most. Then we'll focus on the mechanism of evolution, that is, how it works. And finally, we'll end with some observations of evolution and some of the evidence that is out there in support of this. Let's start with a brief history of who Charles Darwin was. He was actually born on the same day as Abraham Lincoln, and when I say that, I mean specifically he was born on the same day. They share the same birth date, they were born in the same year, and so when people celebrate Abraham Lincoln's birthday, I also tend to celebrate Charles Darwin's birthday. Now, Charles Darwin had a fascination with nature that went all the way back to his earliest childhood. But one thing that's important to know about him is that he wasn't a very outwardly spoken person. He was very much an introvert. He was kind of like the kid that got picked on the playground, but he also really was fascinated with the natural world around him. And unlike a lot of kids I know, he actually had a beetle collection when he was just a 10-year-old boy, which I also had, so I kind of have that connection with him. Anyway, one of the other things that he is really noted for is that he dropped out of medical school. Now, it's important that you understand that this had a lot to do with his personality and less to do with his academic aptitude. He was an incredibly smart guy, and he breezed his way through the first year of med school, where the whole point is to just learn the bones and the muscles and all of the body parts. And instead, he dropped out actually after his second year in medical school, which was the practical year, where he had to actually observe somebody have a surgery. Now, back then, in the days of early Charles Darwin, there was no such thing as anesthesia. So watching somebody screaming in bloody murder while they were being operated on was not something that Charles Darwin could handle, so he actually dropped out. Now, this really troubled him and his family. They're like, well, if you're not going to become a doctor, what could you possibly be? Well, they had already made inroads in the clergy, and even though Charles Darwin's father did not feel that he had the leadership skills to be very good in the clergy, they did understand that his childhood fascination with nature, if they were to pursue that as a career, the only way to study nature was to do so within the clergy, because it turns out there was very little difference between the church and the state at that time. The church essentially ran all the museums, they ran all of the universities, and so it made sense that if you're going to study nature, the best way to do it is to go through the clergy and study it that way. Now, there were a lot of very controversial concepts that were coming about in the earliest days of Darwin, actually before he became a working scientist, when he was still just a teenager, and even into his 20s. There were many other scientists out there that were beginning to see the world differently than the dogma of the day. And the dogma of the day means the general way that everybody was taught at the time, which was always done in a biblical context. The problem was that as scientists uncovered new information, specifically in the field of geology, looking at rocks and mountains and fossils and all that sort of thing, new ideas began to formulate. Well, one of the basic premises at this time was that the Earth was incredibly young, that it must have been only a few thousand years old. Well, that was at odds with what some of the geologists were coming up with at the time. Some of the geologists were actually pointing to the Earth being much, much older than that. Well, at the time, the Pope was really under a lot of pressure to come up with an answer that would satisfy the church and also the evidence that people were coming up with around them. So the Pope at the time actually hired an Anglican archbishop by the name of James Ussher to calculate the actual age of the earth. And of course, James Ussher said, "Thank you, I will definitely do this." Now, you got to keep in mind, James Ussher was no slouch. He was actually a calculus professor at one of the universities. So, as crazy as it may sound, when the Pope comes to you and says, you need to figure out how old the earth is, and I'm going to give you all the biblical texts, and your job is to go through and count all the begets and the begats, and eventually you need to come up with a number for me. And this needs to be something that I can defend when I go and talk to people in the public. So this is what he came up with. He came up with October 23rd, 4004 BCE. Now, that puts the Earth at basically 6,024 years old as of this coming October, as of the last October 2020. So that's obviously a very young Earth. Doesn't even look a day over 4.5 billion. Okay, that's kind of a joke because we actually do know that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, not 6,000 years old. And again, I really want to point out that James Ussher was not a stupid guy. He was asked to do an impossible task. He came up with a number just like he was told to. Whether or not he actually believed that is another matter. He gave the Pope what he wanted, and so thus ensued a very heated debate among the scientists that were coming up with new information and the dogmatic way of teaching the age of the Earth in schools. And yet there were still some scholarly attempts to try and reconcile the stories that were told in creation along with the observations that were being made at the time. Now, some scientists were suggesting that the Earth must be very old. It needs to be older than 6,000 years in order to explain some of the observations that they were making in geology. Well, Cuvier, who was a curator at one of the local universities, was actually tasked with coming up with an alternate explanation, and he did. He came up with something called multiple catastrophes. And in multiple catastrophes, basically what he was saying is the Earth can change in the way that it looks in a very short period of time. It does not require these long, gradual changes like some of these other geologists were saying. And he cited things like massive floods and tsunamis and earthquakes and all of these other things that could happen, tornadoes. And that these, once they've gone through, can actually change the face of the planet in a matter of minutes, seconds, hours, days, but definitely not millions of years. So was Cuvier right? Yes, of course he was. These things do happen, but they don't necessarily negate the fact that the Earth could potentially still be very old. It just means that along with very old processes, things that take a long period of time, there are also short processes that could be acting upon that. Anyway, so the controversy ensued. Meanwhile, in the field of biology, along comes another guy by the name of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. And Lamarck actually came up with some very interesting ideas prior to the time of Darwin. And he came up with this concept of inheritance of acquired characteristics. Very interesting idea that says that organisms can actually change over their lifetime based on a concept called use and disuse. The idea that an organism that uses a trait or a characteristic about themselves, and if it is favorable, then it will be amplified over the course of their life, and they'll be able to pass that characteristic on to their offspring. Okay, so here's the image down here of a giraffe that Lamarck basically described. He said, imagine having a short-necked giraffe at some point in the past. And this giraffe is trying to reach those leaves up there, and eventually it stretches its neck and stretches its neck until eventually it reaches those leaves and is able to eat those leaves. So that longer neck that it develops over its lifetime, well, that is an example of use, right? Any other feature about this animal that it's not using would be an example of disuse. Things that are used become accentuated. Things that are not being used become de-emphasized. Okay, that is a great idea because it implies that organisms can change over time, but there were some fatal flaws with this idea, some very serious problems with it. Things that perhaps they didn't understand back then, but you probably have heard of. Have you guys heard of the term DNA? Okay, DNA is the molecule that essentially describes you. It is the instructions on how to make you, on how you behave, how your physiology works. All of that is described in your DNA. And here's the kicker. The DNA that you are born with is the same DNA that you die with. And so this is really important because Lamarck didn't understand this back then. Actually, nobody did. There was no such knowledge of DNA back then. So we're going to do this experiment, this thought experiment with you. I want you to imagine having two rats, a male rat and a female rat, and you're going to have them get together and make baby rats, okay? But before you do that, you're going to take your kitchen knife and you are going to cut off their tails. Okay, again, this is just a thought experiment, so don't get freaked out. These two rats are going to get together and make babies after their tails have been cut off. So here's the question you need to ask yourself. How many of the baby rats that come from this mom and dad are going to have their tails? Now, hopefully, you know the answer to this. The answer is all of them, right? They will all have their tails. Because when you cut the tails off of those rats, what are you not changing about the rats? Hopefully you know the answer to this. You're not changing their DNA. That's right. The DNA stays the same regardless of how much you modify their bodies. No matter how much this giraffe may theoretically stretch its neck, it is not changing its DNA in the process, and so therefore the babies that are born from this are not going to be the result of any morphology or any physical changes that are occurring in the life of this giraffe. So Lamarck was close in that he implied that organisms can change over time, but he had his mechanism wrong. They don't change in the lifetime of the organism, okay? This is actually a good thing. It's why your kids, if you have your ears pierced or if you have tattoos, you don't have to worry about your kids being born with tattoos and pierced ears, because doing so to yourself, to your own body, is not actually changing your DNA. It's not changing you in a way that is heritable to your offspring. Okay, so that's a couple of important ideas. So even though Lamarck got it wrong, he was right in a sense that organisms can change over time, but it took the work of Darwin to eventually pinpoint the correct mechanism for this. Okay, one other person I want to introduce you to is Sir Charles Lyell. This is actually a geologist, okay? He's not a biologist. He actually did work for a university, and actually his job was to go around the English countryside and work out the geology of that so that they could build more houses. I mean, he was like a practical geologist, but he was also a university professor. And when he began looking at the English countryside, he began developing this idea of uniformitarianism. He looked at the rocks and decided there is absolutely no way the rocks can be shaped the way they are. I mean, think about this. This is prior to plate tectonics, okay? But he's making observations about the world and saying this can't be possibly formed over just 6,000 years. The Earth has to be older, and things like the hillsides, the ocean basins, all of that are probably formed over very slow, continuous processes. So in order to explain that, because people just couldn't wrap their heads around this idea of uniformitarianism, humans are not living long enough to observe this. So Charles Lyell actually presents this idea of geologic time, a time scale over which these geologic processes can occur and are conceptualized. And it was such a good idea, he actually formalized it in a textbook called The Principles of Geology. It went through a number of prints, and it was an incredibly successful book that was used in the geology departments of all the universities in Europe. And it directly challenged the idea that the Earth was only 6,000 years old. Okay, This is why Lyell is so important. It turns out that Darwin had a copy of Lyell's book, and he was fascinated with it. Okay, as a young biologist, he actually got hired on to be the naturalist aboard a very special boat, an exploratory boat called the HMS Beagle, Her Majesty's ship, the Beagle. And armed with this new information from Lyell's geology book, he began to go out on this sailing adventure with a crazy captain, and they had lots of cool adventures. But there was one problem. You see, this entire voyage was all out to sea, and Darwin had never spent a whole lot of time on a boat, let alone out on the ocean. They sailed from Europe all the way down to South America. They leapfrogged all the way around South America and eventually made their way to the Galapagos, which is where Darwin is famous for having studied. And then he traveled throughout the South Pacific to New Zealand, around Australia, through the Indian Ocean and around Africa, back to South America, and then back to Europe. And this was a very long journey. It was supposed to be just a 3-year journey. It ended up being almost 5 years. And one of the major problems here is that Darwin got incredibly seasick, very seasick. And while most people that get seasick, if you just stay out in the ocean for a couple of days, eventually you get your sea legs and the seasickness goes away. That's in about 95% of people. Well, Darwin was the other 5%. He was the guy who never got over seasickness. He threw up pretty much all the way across the Atlantic. Once he got to South America, he got off the boat and did not want to get back on it ever again. And so even though the captain is like, hey, we're moving to our next location, you need to get back on the boat, Darwin told him, look, tell me where we're going next, and I'll meet you there by caravan. So the captain was fine with that. So they landed here in Bahia. That was the first place they landed in what is now present-day Brazil. And he met him down in Rio de Janeiro, which was the second stop. And he did that whole thing by caravan on the back of a horse. Now that's good for us. It's good for us because he made so many great discoveries that he would have overlooked if he had just stayed on the boat all the way around South America. He gained all this knowledge around South America before even going to the Galapagos, which is the place he's famous for. So thank goodness the seasickness set in, because we now are benefiting from the knowledge he gained from his land adventures. Okay, so once Darwin gets back to Europe, that's it. He doesn't want to set foot on a boat ever again. He's through with the seasickness, but it doesn't matter. He's already amassed a lot of data, and he is spending now years analyzing it. In fact, he starts spending decades analyzing it. He begins formulating these groundbreaking ideas of how organisms, species might change over time and adapt over time. And keep in mind, remember this guy's personality. Darwin was not a big spokesman kind of guy. He was very quiet, soft-spoken, and he was averse to conflict. He did not like the idea of being at odds with anybody, let alone the church that he was educated in. So this was really sad for him. He was very scared by the implications of what he was saying or what he was discovering, because it went directly at odds with what he was taught in the clergy and what was being taught in the clergy. So he figures, if I'm going to put forward these groundbreaking ideas, I need to have some more information to back it up, to make it more robust. And so he is sitting in the back of a lecture one day by a guy by the name of Sir Thomas Malthus. Malthus is an economist, again, not a biologist, but he's an economist. And he's giving a lecture on resource use and population growth. I know it's not all that interesting to most people, like you'd probably fall asleep in the back of this lecture, but Darwin didn't fall asleep. He was very, very much inspired by what Sir Thomas Malthus was saying. It gave him some interesting ideas. So again, Malthus was an economist, and one of the main arguments that he made in this lecture is that as population growth increases, it leads to an increased demand on resources, okay? So in this case, he's talking specifically about the people in England. The population growth that was going on in England at the time followed this blue line. It was what was called exponential growth. And so we were beginning to see exponential growth of the European countryside, but England in particular. Now, that's all well and good, but they were also trying to increase the amount of resources, basically croplands and crops that they could grow, to try and keep up with the growing population of people. And they couldn't quite do it. They could increase the resource output, but only in a linear fashion. And you'll see that they're not growing at the same rate. And as time marches on, and as this disparity between the number of people and the resources available to the people, as that disparity increases, you're going to end up with struggle and conflict, and it's going to lead to anarchy and overthrow of governments and all kinds of other bad things, which Malthus then continued on in that lecture to discuss. But Darwin stops at this point and goes, oh my goodness, this is exactly what I need. This provides my frame of reference for understanding the conditions under which populations might change over time, how they might adapt to new environments. So, along with Malthus's information, Darwin also pieces together a few other things, a few other observations that he had made on his voyage around the world on the Beagle. Number one is high reproductive potential. All animals and plants have the capacity to produce way more offspring than can possibly survive. Not that they always do, but that they have the ability to do so. For example, this right here, the picture is actually of a coral head. So this is coral over here. And all of these little white dots over here are coral spawns. They're spores that the spawn is the spawn. These are spores that the coral is releasing. Now, each one of these little spores could potentially develop into its own coral head. Now, is it true that all of these are going to become coral? No, probably not. In fact, only a small fraction of these are going to actually make it and become corals. And yet, this coral head has the ability to make way more offspring than can possibly survive. Okay, so that's the number one observation. He's trying to understand why that is. Number two, he also recognizes a struggle for existence, the fact that life is hard. And this is a great example, penguins having to survive in extremely frigid Antarctic weather. So maybe some of them are going to survive this cold, snowy environment, but they need to eventually get to the coast and jump in the ocean and feed on fish. Not all of them are going to even survive making it out to the ocean, but those that do are also faced with additional perils, right? Wonderful, you made it over the ice without dying. Now you also have to make it into the ocean and not die there too. So what he recognized is that there may be many survivors in your population, but not everybody gets to live. And the question that Darwin began to ask is this totally random or not? Is it just a total random occurrence that this particular penguin didn't make it? Or is there something different about the ones that make it and the ones that don't? So he began viewing the world in terms of challenges facing these populations, okay? So imagine that you have 1,000 members of a population. We can think of penguins even, that's fine. Let's have 1,000 penguins. Now, of those 1,000 penguins, we're going to stick them in an environment of extremes, okay? Maybe it's too cold, maybe it's too hot for everybody to do well. Maybe it's too windy or too wet or too dry, whatever the case may be. Because of the environmental extremes, not all 1,000 of those penguins are going to make it. Maybe only 50% of them will make it. Whatever the case may be, it's not 100%. Now, of those that do make it though, now they have to deal with food issues. Maybe there's not enough food to feed everybody. Maybe it's not the right kind of food, or they're not feeding at the right time. Whatever the case may be, another subset of the individuals in your populations are now going to drop out, not able to deal with this food shortage issue or being there at the wrong time. Of those survivors, now they have to deal with predators that are trying to pick them off and use them as food. Only then, your final remaining individuals are competing with each other for those very resources. And if you are too slow, too weak, too scared, or too dumb, you're not going to make it. So it's almost like the environment here, along with all of these other factors, are a filtering mechanism that determines, or I guess that decides, which individuals are less likely to make it and which ones are more likely to make it. And the bottom line here is not just to survive. The bottom line is to survive, to reproduce, to survive long enough to reproduce. That's super important. Okay, a couple of other observations. Darwin began to make connections with the geologic past and the present. And he did so particularly in Argentina when local people began bringing him fossils to identify things that they had been wondering for years what they were. Now, Darwin was a pretty learned guy. He'd been through every museum in Europe. He pretty much knew the bone structures of most of the living organisms on the planet. And when these people brought him these fossilized bones, he took one look at them and he knew what they were. They were armadillo size, or I should say they were armadillo bones. The problem was that they were not armadillo-sized bones. They were armadillo in shape, but they were many times larger than a modern living armadillo. After reconstructing them, and they eventually were given the name Glyptodon, he recognized that these were animals that are not currently living, that lived in the past, but that are related to modern-day armadillos, which are much smaller. The Glyptodons were probably the size of a VW bug. They were gigantic, and again, they resembled living armadillos. Okay, so he made those connections between things that are extinct from the past and their connection to living things today. Another observation that Darwin made is that every organism out there, every population of organisms exhibits some sort of variation in their species. I mean, heck, that's true of all humans, right? Just put 10 humans together and take a look around. Unless you have two identical twins in there, no two people actually look alike. That's even true of you and your relatives. You might look like your mom and dad, very similar to them, but not identical to either one of them, right? There's variation within a population, and that's even true of these tortoises down here, which is where Darwin actually noticed a lot of this. If you pick any two tortoises, certainly we're not tortoises, so it'd be a really hard thing for us to tell them apart. But the tortoises can tell, and there is variation in all of those tortoises, in the length of their nose, to the length of their neck, to the flatness of their shell, to all of these other traits. And in fact, the animals that you see here in the upper right, these are all barnacles. They're not different species of barnacles. These are all the same species of barnacles. They're just exhibiting variation in their shell morphology, in the makeup of their shells. And that is true in pretty much every living organism in existence. Here's an example of a bunch of shells that are exhibiting morphological differences in shell color. So Darwin recognized this, and he suggested things like, in these heritable traits, can provide some sort of advantage under certain environmental conditions. So, for example, some of these shells are lighter, some of them are darker, and so in this case, the darker ones actually absorb more heat. Well, that might be good if you're living in northern latitudes, in the range of this particular snail on the East Coast. In the northern latitudes, it's probably nice to be a darker color because you're absorbing more sunlight and you're staying nice and warm. But in the southern edge of the range for this animal, down in Florida, it's probably not a good idea to be dark in color because you'll be absorbing too much heat. It's probably better to be lighter in color. So you're dealing with different environmental conditions, one very warm, one very cold. And so the different shell colors might actually provide an advantage in one set of habitats, but maybe not in another. So these are the sort of examples of variation that Darwin was observing. And what he noted is that some of that variation can be passed on to your offspring. This part of it is similar to what Lamarck said. The difference here, though, is that it's not about an organism changing its morphology in its lifetime. It's about providing variation to some future generation, and some of them get chosen because they're able to survive the environment, whereas others drop out because they can't survive the environment. So that's important to understand that distinction. It is not the change of the organism over their lifetime. Okay, so here's an example of variation in a population. We've got 6 circles that all have different colors and patterns. Let's focus on this one here. When this individual has babies, if it does it through the process of sexual selection or sexual reproduction, we notice that the offspring all look very similar, but not identical to each other. This variation is very important because it means that some individuals are potentially going to be able to survive and adapt to some future environment better than the others. And so we see this getting passed on from generation to generation as variation continues to be expressed in populations. So all of these ideas kind of put together. This is a summary of the big idea of Darwin. Number 1, species differ in traits that are heritable, okay? And that is that variation that exists. And that variation is going to affect the ability of organisms, ability of individuals within that population to survive and therefore potentially to reproduce. What's more is that species are capable of producing far more offspring than the resources can support. Given that, it's going to lead to competition among those that do manage to make it to the point of surviving settlement. Once they settle out, they're now going to compete for those scarce resources, and not everybody's going to make it. Given this, all of these things in combination actually cause populations to change over time to essentially accommodate some future environment that you can't predict. Some are going to make it, some are not going to make it. It's a selective mechanism that is determined by the state of the environment at some point in the future that is unpredictable. So evolution does not happen in any direction. Evolution is just the change in a population in response to a changing environment. Since the environment is always changing, populations are always changing in response. So this is the natural selective mechanism that Darwin came up with, natural selection. So make sure you understand these bullet points and how they kind of relate to each other. So now let's get into the specifics of natural selection. We're going to finish up with the specifics of this. Natural selection is defined as differential survival and reproduction. Differential survival and reproduction means that of all the babies that are born in a population, not all of them are going to have an equal chance of surviving, and that what determines that is the environment that happens to be in existence at the time. And over time, a filtering essentially takes place in the population, which causes those that survive to now be the future reproducers, and they are going to essentially set the tone for the next generation. The problem is for them is that the environment is constantly changing. And so there's no way to predict which offspring in some future are going to be successful and which ones are not. It's just kind of a roll of the dice. And so it ends up causing this genetic makeup change in populations over time. One thing that's super important for you guys to understand is what is one problem with how non-scientists sometimes view evolution. This is an important tagline here in this cartoon. Natural selection does not grant organisms what they need. So here's a beaver, and you know beavers gnaw on trees and knock them down. Boy, wouldn't it be wonderful to wake up one day if you're a beaver and have a chainsaw for a hand instead of having to use your teeth. So this beaver's super excited about that. The problem is that there's absolutely no way something like this could happen, even conceptually, because remember, the DNA that this beaver was born with is the DNA that this beaver is going to die with. There's no way that you can have a change like this occurring in the DNA of that beaver to produce a trait that it wants. You don't get to choose the traits that you have. You're simply born with them. They were given to you by your parents, and they are either good in the environment that you are living in now or they're not. But there's no way your parents could have predicted that because they didn't know what the environment was going to be like when you were born. So, here you are. That is not how evolution works. In fact, this is a really good way to think about it. Evolution is simply a process. It's not directed in any one direction. It is simply a meandering process. It is a population of organisms modifying over time as certain individuals get dropped out, leaving behind the remainder, which will now then be the ones to reproduce into the future. And so that process is natural selection. It's one of the main drivers, one of the main mechanisms that causes evolution to occur. So evolution is the process, natural selection is the mechanism that drives that process. Okay, another good way to think about it here is that those that are superior competitors end up mating more. Like this guy here, there's one individual male with a whole bunch of females. It's not to say that there aren't other males that might want to reproduce with these females. They certainly could exist, but they're all swimming around out there in the ocean, and they're not gaining access to these females like this one male has. So organisms with favorable traits, like this male probably has, they tend to survive better and reproduce more. So they are more represented in the future population. As they make more babies, their babies are more of a reflection of them, of the survivors. And so these are the traits that end up getting passed on to the next generation. Okay, the flip side to that is unfavorable traits, ones that cause you to survive less well or reproduce less well, tend to drop out of the population because individuals that have them aren't able to reproduce as much. So now this is an important consideration. Only genes that are non-lethal, that don't kill you, get passed on. Anything that causes you to die, obviously you're not reproducing, and so those genes don't get passed on to the future. Like this picture here. This guy here is engaging in some very risky behavior, and he's probably not going to make it through this tunnel here if he stands up and looks backwards on this roller coaster. Likewise, we have these really funny things called Darwin Awards. These are people that are kind enough to remove themselves from the gene pool of humans through their own stupidity. So here we have three gentlemen, 1, 2, and then the hand over here, 3. And they've decided that they want to stay cool but also operate their barbecue, their electric barbecue, their hibachi. So here they are cooking. Of course, they can't do it outside the pool. They've chosen to do it inside the pool, which is not a very smart thing. And this is a plug-in hibachi. So, of course, they have to bring power in, and you're going to take your floating plastic slippers to essentially buoy up the electrical plug here. Not a smart thing to do. And, you know, they might survive this if they are lucky enough, but the fact that they would even do this implies that they're probably willing to take other risks in life too, and they will probably kill themselves. And so stupid genes like this tend to drop out of the gene pool, and so, you know, there you go. The Darwin Awards. It's meant to be a joke, but you kind of get the idea here. Essentially, the environment here is acting like a filter. Nature is like a filter. Let's say that these little bugs up here represent the variation that you might see in a population, but because of climate issues, predators, habitat issues, the presence of disease, and all kinds of other filtering mechanisms that are natural, not all of these individuals are going to make it. Some are going to be able to make it through the filter. And of course, now the ones that make it, they are the ones that are going to be the future reproducers. They're the ones that are making the babies into the future, not the ones that didn't make it. So the next generation ends up looking different. It ends up looking like these guys, not like these guys, right? And certainly not like these guys. So that's what we're talking about here, is with every generation, as parents give rise to offspring, the change in the in that variation that existed in the parent population may look different in the offspring population. That is evolution. That is precisely evolution, and it is exactly what has led to the incredible diversity of animals and plants and other organisms that we see on the planet. And not only the outward look of the animal can be conserved in this way, but also an animal's physiology and their behavior. Anything that will help an organism cope with its current set of environmental conditions. And so what we end up seeing is natural selection producing individuals that are best adapted to survive in a particular environment. But that's not to say that these really cool looking fish, this is a pygmy seahorse and this is a porcupine pufferfish, it's not to say that these two things are perfect for their environment. They're not perfect. What they are is the best combination of traits to survive in the particular environment in which they find themselves. Now, if the environment changes, these animals, or not these individuals, but the populations that they live in, will have to adapt, or the organisms will go extinct. Okay, it's all about reproducing, making babies that have some new variation within them. Some of them hopefully will survive the future, and those that survive will probably do so because they have traits that are good for surviving in that future environment. Okay, now let's switch gears. Now that we understand the mechanism of evolution and how it works, let's look at some evidence out there that we point to demonstrate that evolution is in fact a central premise. Number one, homologous structures. Homologous structures refer to anatomical features that organisms tend to share in common, not in their functioning of those structures, but in the origin of those structures. For example, on the left here, you're looking at the forelimb, essentially like your arm or the front limb of your cat or your dog, and we've aligned them here and we've color-coded them so that all of the homologous bones are coded the same. So for example, this pink bone is your humerus bone. That's the bone between your shoulder and your elbow. And notice the dimensions here. This bone is roughly the same length as the bones in your lower arm. This is your radius and your ulna here. And they're not exactly the same length, but they're pretty close. And there's a reason why this geometry works so well for humans. Let's compare it first to a whale, for example. This is a whale's forelimb. In this case, the humerus bone of a whale has been largely compressed down. It's a much smaller ratio of the overall arm. And what's more is that in the case of the whale, the structures that make up the greatest proportion of that limb are actually the fingers. Well, that's not the case with the humans. The reason why it's the fingers is because whales are much larger than we are. They live in water, and they must pull their body through the water. If they did so with forelimbs that had the geometry of our limbs, they would break their limbs in a second. This geometry is not good for pulling large amounts of weight through the water. Our geometry is perfect for swinging from trees and throwing spears and making pizzas and doing all the other things that humans do. But for whales, this geometry is what works best for pulling yourself through the water. Now, whales and humans do have a common ancestor that goes back way, way, way long ago, many millions of generations. And yet, over those millions of generations, because the ancestors of whales and the ancestors of humans were faced with very different environmental conditions, the forelimb, which started out the same, has become modified over time to suit the purpose of humans and to suit the purpose of whales swimming in the ocean. Okay, we also see a similar sort of homologous structure in the development of our embryos. This is a chicken embryo, this is a pig embryo, and this is what you like when you're only about 3 to 4 weeks in development. At these stages, these organisms, even though they are different species and they're going to develop into very different kinds of animals, they all have a very similar look to them. They are homologous because chickens, pigs, and humans have a common ancestor at some point in our embryonic past, in our evolutionary past. So homologous structures refer to structures that have a common origin but might be used for a different function in the life of the present day animal. Okay? This is in contrast to analogous structures. In analogous structures, these are things that actually serve the same purpose but have different evolutionary origins. So, for example, a penguin's forelimb here for swimming, and let's say this fish's front fins, or this crab's hind legs, which are also flat. These are all flattened out structures for the purpose of swimming. Now, the front arm of a penguin and the front limb of this beetle and the hind limb of this crab have nothing in common evolutionarily. However, they both are flat, or all of them are flat, because that's the best shape for swimming. So they've all essentially evolved independently. They've evolved a similar solution for the same problem of how do you swim through the water. You do so with flat paddle-like structures. So again, analogous structures are independently evolved. They don't have a common origin, even though they come to look similar because they serve a similar purpose. Now, another anatomical observation, vestigial structures. Vestigial structures are structures in your body and in the body of other organisms that appears to have had an advantage in the past, but doesn't have an advantage now. Some examples in humans include the human tailbone, your appendix, human body hair, and a few other examples. Clearly, we don't have an extensive tail anymore. There was an advantage over the evolutionary history of humans to lose one's hind tail. This happened many millions of years ago. Now, whatever advantage we gained by losing our tail, there was no further advantage in losing the part of your tail that is actually internal. And you can feel it if you use your fingers and you feel right above your butt, you'll feel that little bump, and that's your tailbone. And so that is the point from which your tail in your ancestor would have extended from. So doesn't serve a purpose any longer, but it sticks around because there's no further advantage to losing it. And the same thing is true with your appendix and with body hair. Now, you might be asking, well, wait a minute. I had a friend who had appendicitis and they had to have their appendix taken out. Well, yes, it can be bad, but it is so uncommon that it doesn't actually hurt humans on the whole to still possess this. The appendix is just some vestigial structure that is in our gut that doesn't serve a purpose any longer, although it probably did for digestion in some ancestral humans that existed in our distant past. So the other example of that from the ocean would be the pelvis in whales. Whales have pelvises. They don't have hind legs. So what are your hind legs attached to, or what are your legs attached to? They attach to your pelvis, right? So if you don't have hind legs, why would you still have a pelvis? And the answer is because whales used to have hind legs. Yes, they did. The ancestors of whales actually walked on land. And as they became aquatic organisms, they began to have their limbs atrophy and shrink in size until eventually they disappeared. Whales no longer make hind legs. And just as with the human tailbone, while there was a selective advantage to losing your hind limbs, there was no further selective advantage to losing the pelvis that the hind limbs are attached to, because the pelvis is internal. So they retain the pelvis, no problem. And the same thing is true actually in some species of snakes, which they don't have hind limbs either, but they still do have the remnants of a pelvis, which implies that they evolved from ancestral reptiles that had hind legs. So these are vestigial structures. They're structures that don't appear to have a purpose now because they are a remnant of a structure that did have a purpose in the past. Okay, case in point, if you look at the rare case, it does happen every now and then. Whales, they never lost the ability to make hind limbs per se. That's not the way DNA works. And without getting into too much detail on this, what usually happens is you either break down the gene that makes hind legs or you gain a gene that turns off leg production. Either way, whales actually hidden in their DNA still have the ability, or the instructions I should say, on how to make hind legs. They just aren't expressed in modern whales. However, sometimes there's a mutation, there's an error that occurs that causes a whale to express an old gene, causing it to grow these little tiny hind limbs. And there's two cases here. The color picture here is of a sperm whale sporting little tiny hind legs right there. And this inset is a black and white picture that actually came from a scientific publication from 1921 entitled "A Remarkable Case of External Hind Limbs in a Humpback Whale." Yes, it's true. On rare occasion, whales can produce hind limbs because their DNA still has it hidden in there somewhere. And sometimes those things can come out and be expressed. Another example of this are dolphins that have been found to be sporting hind limbs. This is one that was discovered in 2006 in Japan. And it's a dolphin. Dolphins don't normally have hind limbs like this, but here's one that was sporting them. And guess what? If you go back 6 million years in dolphin evolution, dolphins of 6 million years ago did have hind limbs, just like this. So, kind of cool that even happens. This is now some of the, this and many other things. We have lots of other lines of evidence in support of evolution. And so now that you understand the mechanism and you've seen some of the evidence in support of it and you have a background of the history, you now have a good basis for understanding the organisms. And that's the next part of this course. We've now completed the basics of biology, and I thank you for your attention, and I will see you all in class.